How is it structured? We will split the workshop in two parts. First, we have an introduction on the topic. Then we will have an expert inputs and the chance also for a Q&A where you can ask your questions and really interact with our experts. Then we split out in 4 breakout groups to further discuss in more depth, in more detail, certain aspects of immunity certification and talk about issues that arise or might arise in the future and potential solutions we see or sort of recommendations we have also for policy and decision makers. And the content from tonight's discussion will then be summarized and published in form of a blog post and be communicated as well, so that it's not just about having a good discussion tonight, but really bringing this message also to policymakers and interested people and stakeholders. At the very end, at 9:30, we will then quickly wrap up and the event will officially end. Then we have 30 more minutes where you can stay along. We will provide breakout groups where you can further exchange with participants, meet other people, and exchange on ideas there. Now, I would like to quickly give you a bit of a context why we have been doing this, organizing this workshop, and where we come from the perspective of health data governance. First of all, for those who don't know foraus and Census Advice, so first of all, foraus is a grassroots think tank, which is based in Switzerland. We function as a bottom-up platform, which enables young people and interested people to have a voice, to have a say in foreign policy-related issues or topics. We publish policy recommendations, which are evidence-based and take the form of policy briefs, blog posts, and so on. And we also organize political debates around foreign policy-related topics or international relations-related topics more generally. And Census Advice, a quick word also about our partner Census Advice, is a consulting firm based in Zurich, which works at the intersection of politics, economy, and society, and is specialized in qualitative dialogue and discourse analysis. So what have we done together last year? We held a Swiss-wide participatory process, which included more than 140 stakeholders and interested citizens around the topic of health data governance, asking the question, what should Switzerland do about health data governance, and especially Geneva, what role should Geneva also take on this, on the way we use data, we store data, we handle data, broadly said, the governance around health data. And one of the key recommendations out of this process, we published a study actually with 12 policy recommendations, and one of the key recommendations was that International Geneva should become a global hub for health data governance. So what we were asking ourselves is, how can we, now that we have this study, we have our recommendations, go one step further and operationalize this recommendation and look into a practical case, a use case, to think about concrete next steps. And there we thought COVID-19 in general, but especially now COVID-19 certification, is a really good use case to discuss health data governance and the role that International Geneva should take, because many of the questions we ask more generally for health data are also relevant now with these certification systems. How do we use the data which is considered by these systems? How do we handle it in general? How is it stored, and so on? And this is why we wanted to focus tonight on immunity certification and needed governance framework conditions. But before we continue, I think it's important, we believe it's important that we define what we actually mean by it, because you might have noticed in the news in the last weeks and months that there have been many concepts, different names which emerged, and that actually the concept has also been evolving a bit. Because we heard about vaccine passports, COVID passes, green passes, and so on. And we wanted to define it today as Switzerland actually defined it in the COVID-19 Act, which is a broad definition. Then in some cases, it's actually a bit more narrow. But for in this case, the COVID certificate is giving information on whether people have been vaccinated, whether they recovered from COVID-19 disease, or whether they have been recently tested negative, if, for example, through a PCR test. And this is it's a broad definition, but then we see in some cases you only in some cases these systems, immunity certification systems, only consider vaccine data, or consider maybe vaccine data and data on people who got who recovered from the disease. But this is to give you a bit of a broad definition. Just a comment about how this concept has been evolving. What we saw is that at the beginning we talked a lot about vaccine passports, and then states and also different stakeholders realized maybe it's not good to talk about passports because it's actually official documentation. Let's switch to certification. It's actually we believe it's a better term to talk about these systems and initiatives. And also we had a switch from purely vaccine data to more COVID related data in general. And this is a bit what we see at the moment. And about the form of these kind of systems, it can be in paper. It can also take the form of a digital form, for instance, via an app, where you could have, for instance, a QR code to prove that you have been vaccinated or you recovered from COVID-19. Now, I'd like to say a few words about where we stand globally. We see many public sector-led initiatives, but also initiatives that are led by private sector companies, or also civil society. This list is not exhaustive, but just to give a few examples, we have some front runners with, for instance, Israel with its Green Pass, and Denmark with its so-called COVID Pass. Then there are some of these systems which are in the making, which have been announced for this summer, for June in Switzerland, for instance, with the COVID certificate. Then there's the EU's digital Green Pass. And if we look a bit outside of Europe, we also have the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the Gulf Cooperation Council, which respectively are also considering common certification schemes for their areas. Then you also see that who has an interest and who is interested in these certificates being implemented and used. It's of course also within the industry, especially the tourism industry, the travel industry. There we have the International Air Transport Association, the IATA, which has developed the Travel Pass, which is an app where you can upload certain health-related information on your COVID-19 statuses. There's the so-called Common Pass, which is being developed by the Commons Project and the World Economic Forum, which is and this is a more broader multi-stakeholder project initiative. And then we have also other private sector initiatives, such as, for instance, the Digital Health Pass, which is being developed by IBM, and we have the pleasure to have Ellie Androulaki from IBM Research Net with us. She will tell us a bit more about their work on their side. But so you see that we have really a great patchwork of different systems and initiatives. And here, what we really think and believe, it's important to have international coordination, to have guidelines, so that we have systems which are actually talking to each other, understanding each other, and we don't have different criteria all over the place, all over the world. And here, the World Health Organization has launched the Smart Vaccination Certification Working Group, which is an ad hoc working group, which is currently developing guidelines for which should be used or might be used then internationally. But yeah, we're also really curious to hear a bit from our speaker, Gareth Mail, who's actively involved in this work, how the work is going, where does the WHO stand. But what we also see is that you have bilateral discussions and agreements between states, which are being negotiated, for instance, as we have it between Greece and Cyprus or Greece and Israel. And this might be problematic if you have a patchwork of different systems which are not following the same guidelines, right? And this is why we're here tonight, to think collectively about the way forward. What would be important? What kind of issues do we see? And what kind of solutions could we provide for these questions? But now, yeah, enough from my side. for now, I would like to give the word to Ninian for the next part of the workshop to hear a bit more from our experts.
Thank you, Moritz. And so it's a great pleasure and honor that we have three very renowned speakers today. So experts from the fields from three very different perspectives, so that we have really the governance, the more political view. Then we have someone, Eli Androulaki, from the private sector and from the research sector, Alessandro Blasime. And before we start with the questions and the inputs from our three speakers, I would like to present them to you who is here today. So I would like first to welcome Gareth Mail. He is leading the Department of Digital Health and Innovation at the World Health Organization. He's actually already working for almost more than 15 years for the World Health Organization, where he is doing research on digital health innovations and currently coordinating the work within the Smart Vaccination Certificate Working Group. Then I would also welcome Eli Androulaki from the IBM Switzerland. She will give us her perspective on the private research, private sector, and also from the research perspective. Ellie is a research manager at the IBM Research Lab in Zurich. She's working in the area of blockchain security and applications and joined IBM in 2013, where she is also leading the IBM contributions to security and privacy components of Hyperledger Fabric. She leads currently the research activity within the security and privacy department in the development of a digital health pass. And last but not least, I would also welcome Alessandro Blasime. Alessandro is a senior scientist at the Health Ethics and Policy Lab at the ETH Zurich. In the past, he worked for different academic and research institutions, for example, the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, or he was a postdoctoral researcher at the French National Institute of Health and Medical Research. And so he and his team are following very closely what is being done in terms of research and in the immunity certification system, complicated words. So how does it work? I would like to ask our speakers at the very beginning to give them some inputs from their perspective. We have some questions already prepared, but then we would like to open up very quickly so that all participants can ask their questions. We want really to make this workshop as interactive as possible. But let me start with you, Gareth. Yeah, please tell us a bit more what the role of the World Health Organization and also International Geneva is playing to create internationally used and recognized guidelines on immunity certification, and where do you see also improvement for Geneva to become the future center of health data governance in a larger sense?
Thanks so much for the opportunity to present. It's a real honor, and I wanted to provide a little bit of an overview of the work that we have been doing, and then also to talk a little bit about the role that we see Geneva and the work on global data governance and the opportunities there. I'm going to provide a little bit of a few slides. Hopefully that will maybe ensure that I'm concise and to the point, and you'll have a few visual illustrations in your mind of some of the work that we've been doing. And I'll just note while I'm setting up here, I'm not the director of Digital Health and Innovations Department. I'm just a unit head, thankfully.
Sorry for
but
that.
I do lead the work on. No, that's okay. That's okay. I just wanted to clarify, but also that my work does focus on the Smart Vaccination Certificate with a great team of people working on this. So I wanted to tell a little bit of a story about why WHO and why the International organizations really have focused in this area. WHO for the last 9 or even 12 months, member states have directly reached out to WHO for assistance, guidance, or with specific products that aim to deliver in a digital format a vaccination certificate for COVID. And with each new product, we looked at them and we realized that they all had different features, they all collected different data, they all had different terms of use. And as WHO, we quickly realized that we wouldn't be able to select one digital product to recommend to member states, but that member states would need guidance so that they would be able to look to these different products that the private sector was developing, and that they would be able to make an informed choice based on specifications and guidance. And so we focused on establishing technical specifications, the core data set, what any digital solution would need to do to properly represent the data, to ensure privacy, security, and connect to national tools, and ensure verification, and connect with, between member states. So we issued a open call for experts, and then we worked from January through, and we'll continue to work with these experts to ensure that we have a specification finalized. In January, the International Health Regulations, which is an international policy mechanism, had an emergency committee meeting, the 6th meeting, that advised WHO to coordinate with relevant stakeholders the development of standards for digital documentation of COVID-19 travel-related risk reduction measures that could be implemented on interoperable digital platforms. So we wanted to ensure that we took this advice and that we focused on the specifications. Last week, the emergency committee had their 7th meeting and advised WHO to not just look at the vaccination certificate, but to also consider expansion of this work to include recovery status and laboratory results. So I'm going to present mostly on the vaccine certificate because that's what we have been working on, but recognizing that the specifications will likely expand to these additional areas. The experts came from international agencies, ministries of health, those that had immunization, digital health, and standards expertise, but also in international organizations, including ICAO, ITU, and a huge number of international organizations. We did release the first specifications document on March 19th, and we will be subsequently releasing additional specifications between now and June. Sorry, just give me a minute here. And then, so what is a vaccination certificate? It focuses on the vaccination record needs within a country as a personal record to help ensure continuity of care and to ensure complete vaccination. It also serves the international travel needs. It's a health document to be issued by a public health authority of member states. But because many member states will need to rely on paper and would need the approach to function even if there isn't internet connectivity, we detail in the specifications both the use of paper and plus a QR code, and then a fully digital approach that would leverage an application so that we can ensure that no one is left behind. The focus of the vaccination certificate, the smart vaccination certificate, is proof of vaccination and to reinforce continuity of care. But it's been architected to evolve with the science and the needs of countries should the need for laboratory results prior COVID infection, or if the country wants to leverage the personal certificate as a starting point for a national personal health record. We've made use of standards like FHIR, HL7 FHIR, and the International Patient Summary to future-proof this approach. The focus has really been also around establishing a trust framework, and I'll provide a little bit of an overview of that for those who may not have seen this work. it really focuses on ensuring that if you go to another country and you are and you're taking your certificate and you want to ensure that, and a border guard, for example, wants to ensure that your certificate has been issued by a public health authority, then they're able to verify that. And we recognize that member states, countries themselves will have their own public key infrastructure, and that as WHO, we would not want to verify every single entity, but rather we would host a directory that would link to the public keys that the member states would be sharing with the organization, and that by doing that, that helps to ensure that there is trust in the vaccine certificates that have been issued, and to ensure that they've been issued by a public health authorized authority. And it also ensures that member states are confident in the issuance of that certificate by another entity. The vaccination certificate, as I said before, focuses on the personal health record and this use example for cross-border use. But it's also intended to evolve, if necessary, to include lab results and evidence of previous COVID infection. It draws from the HL7 FHIR International Patient Summary, which ensures that the data is represented in a consistent way. But by using the International Patient Summary, it will also facilitate the opportunity for countries to ensure that individuals can retain their health records for vaccination for COVID, but also potentially for other areas as well on their digital device. There is no transfer of personal data to WHO. Member states are only sharing public keys. And the role of the specifications is not for WHO to develop a specific application. It's really to ensure that the guidance is available so that private sector and member states are able to be confident that the products that are developed will conform to a minimum specification and that they will function together. I think this second question that I was asked to talk about is really the role of Geneva and the future Center for Data Governance. We feel there's a really great opportunity to ensure that the specifications and that the implementation guidance for this product, but I think other products as well, follow appropriate use and ethical application of these specifications. Data is collected at a national level. It isn't shared with WHO, but it is shared with another member state for the purposes of verification. The additional use and opportunity for data is that member states are collecting data that is mapped to standards. And that also provides an opportunity for research purposes and for planning purposes. Should a member state be in a position and be interested in sharing that data in a way that obviously doesn't share the personal information, but is aggregated, we feel that there's a good opportunity for research purposes that would draw from the potential pooling of data for advanced analytics. Again, should countries be interested in that. We recognize the trust of member states between each other and the trust of individuals who have their certificates issued is paramount. So the Geneva, as a center of excellence for data governance, I think will help shepherd the right ethical practices, the right principles to enshrine those in the specifications, at least in this case. WHO, as many will know, cannot enforce recommended protocols to governments. What we can do is establish principles that we would aim and hope that member states would then abide by, so that data is not misused, and that it's used for, and that these overall approaches are used for the global good. So thanks very much. I'll hand back to the organizers. Thank you for the opportunity to present on this.
Thank you so much, Garrett, for these very interesting insights from the World Health Organizations. With that, I would like to ask Ellie from the private sector perspective. So how do you ensure technically trustworthy solution for these systems? And also, how are you already working together with the International Geneva and its institutions?
Yes, thank you. Hi from my side. Let me also say a few words about IBM Research for the ones that are not familiar with it. So IBM Research is a separate organization under IBM brand name, listing more than 3,000 researchers, experts in different domains, and software engineers. And the purpose in life for IBM Research is to essentially become the organic growth engine for IBM, meaning researchers are within the research division are building either prominent extensions to existing products of IBM, or coming up with completely new and novel ideas of new products that IBM should push forward to enhance its business. So blockchain security and applications group that I have the privilege to lead in Zurich is a group consisting of experts in the security and privacy domain who in the last couple of years have been focusing on blockchain, actually more than a couple of years, as well as experts in the distributed systems domain. And the reason why we have this kind of constitution inside of the team that is tuned to work on blockchain system is because we do see a lot of value in the enterprise work on these systems, but we also see a lot of things that need to be improved for these systems to be relevant for at least certain use cases that are strategic. So where HealthPass comes in, HealthPass is essentially a use case or a solution that can, as Garrett mentioned, can be very well served with an identity management system. Public key directories have a prominent position there as gatekeepers of public keys of authorized issuers around the globe in the case of WHO, or around Europe in the case of EU Digital Green certificate gateway, or other systems that are to be specified in the future. And it seemed to us that a permission or enterprise blockchain system would be a nice infrastructure to host this kind of registry, avoiding single point of failure. So to answer your question, how do we ensure technically trustworthy solutions in the context of health passes? I can give you the perspective from our side. We did review very carefully at the time legal frameworks governing what they were called at the time immunity passports, what are called now health passports or vaccination certificates, and brought together security, privacy experts, software engineering skills, of course, together with domain experts in order to specify the exact security and privacy requirements of that particular of the system that we wanted to build. Of course, we had to also investigate what we call trust model in technology, in security technologies, meaning who can you trust among the actors in the system to do what, who you should by no chance trust, and so on and so forth. And this is particularly relevant for matters related to the data privacy. It was clear to us from day one, individual owner of a health certificate, or the subject the health certificate refers to, should be the one controlling the data inside the certificate, and who should be entitled access to that and for how long. After doing that, we devised a solution at two levels. First, at the protocol level, as I said, taking into consideration security and privacy requirements of the system and the considered threat models. We designed a protocol governing the interactions among these actors in a way that would not violate any of the privacy and security properties that we put in place. Security requirements, of course, are related to the enforgeability, the tamper-proof resistance of whatever certificate is being issued, and the assurance on the verifier front that a certificate that has been given to them is authentic, has been issued by an authorized issuer and medical care provider, and that it does correspond to the subject that is showing it to them. And then we also used our system security skills and experts to build an infrastructure that would best honor the protocol, the interactions across the different users that we had designed. So our system is also was designed taking into consideration interoperability requirements, as well as inclusion requirements. We did not want to exclude people that did not own or could not use a smartphone to make use of the system. And as such, we ended up adopting a solution or a flow of information that is very much compatible to the self-sovereign identity exchanges. At the same time, being very much aware of how fast the scientific knowledge around COVID evolves, and therefore the regulation governing vaccination certificates or test certificates, even specification of the content of the actual certificates itself, we did put in place a great extent of flexibility into how these certificates are being defined, how they're being generated, the structure that governs these certificates, and conversion mechanism, clear governance model to upgrade the system when there is a need to do so. For example, because a new type of certificate should be supported, or because a new version of an existing certificate type should be supported. Again, we also always looked at the overall system from a security and privacy perspective, and security and privacy researchers are doomed to always be pessimistic when it comes to the attacker's power. So they always consider the strongest attacker possible. And this is why we resorted into a blockchain-based registry of public keys to avoid the system being at risk if one node that is running the system, in the case of centralized system, goes corrupted or compromised, and so on and so forth. With respect to our interactions, IBM interactions with international Geneva, as you know, IBM is a very big corporation. It has offices in more than 170 countries, which means that includes most, if not all, of the countries members of International Geneva. I'm not aware of all the engagements between IBM and International Geneva members. I can highlight at least a few of them that are closer in the Zurich lab, and mostly relate to engagements with non-government members, including CERN, where the IBM research lab in Zurich worked on the application of quantum computing, combining it with AI and deep neural networks in order to eventually discover a new physics phenomena. And possibly also move beyond our current best models of the universe. That's the ultimate vision. There is also collaboration between Danish Refugee Council and Mixed Migration Center. It took place a few years ago that aimed to better understand migration drivers and evidence-based policy guidance. Tools there was data and machine learning, and the outcomes was a tool to predict migration and refugees flows. That ultimately aimed, of course, to improve the protection of people on the move. Last but not least is the European Commission, with which we have plenty of interactions. IBM Research Lab in Zurich has participated in Ireland and also in Israel, have been participating in a whole lot European projects, Horizon 2020, actually more than 50, triggering collaborations with more than 500 countries. We also have a lot of several ERC grants. We have a lot of ERC grant holders in our labs, working in multiple disciplines, nanotechnology, quantum safe crypto, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that concludes my answer to you.
Thank you so much, Ellie. I have learned a lot about IBM and your work also with International Geneva. It was very interesting. And that brings me now to the more ethical and also research perspective. And I would like to ask you, Alessandro, so what is needed from an ethical perspective to ensure trust in these systems? Are there already best practice out there, or even a worst practice? And yeah, where does this bring us from an ethical perspective? Where does this discussion lead us in terms of ethics and health data governance?
Yes, thank you very much, Mignane. And yeah, that's a huge topic. It's really interesting to see how the crisis that we are experiencing has actually given a lot of impetus to digitalization in the health domain. And this, by the way, has created a lot of work for people who have to deal with ethics, like me, and in particular, those who are occupied studying the ethics of medical technologies. So if you think about how telemedicine has expanded during the pandemics, it's quite interesting. I mean, basically in a few months' time, we have realized progress that would otherwise have taken decades to occur. But think also about digital health innovations such as digital contact tracing apps, or perhaps more trivially, online systems to book your vaccine dose. Or something that I discovered today as a citizen, as a resident here in Switzerland, the Alert Swiss app, that is the general alerting system in Switzerland, now incorporates the possibility to alert you when vaccination is open to your tier, to your group. And it's interesting because to do that, you need to be geolocalized. Okay, so you have to give the app the permission to use your GPS data. So this this already tells you that basically there are a host of ethical issues around the way in which personal data is being collected, stored, and used for purposes that are related to the current crisis. But when we speak about the ethics of these technologies, we need to distinguish between the ethics of using digital tools, for example, to monitor or treat patients. This would count as medical ethics, and the ethics of all the activities and initiatives, including public policy initiatives that aim at containing the spread of the virus or reducing its burden. For example, trying to crush the epidemic curve to release pressure from health systems, or imposing restrictions on individual liberty or rights, including rights to movement that we now want to restore by implementing digital vaccine certificates. So this latter form of ethics is generally called public health ethics, and it differs from the ethics of medicine mostly because it considers the impact of policy decisions, not the impact of medical acts. And it considers that impact on the well-being of communities or populations, not of individual patients, for example. But of course, a lot of the ethical trade-offs here are still between public health objectives and individual rights and liberties. And the case of how we are going to restore or according to some actually further limit freedom of movement through digital certificates is a case in point. So what is more, also private actors operate in this space, of course, and IBM is one of them. IBM is developing its own system for certification of immunity status. But also in the case of digital contact tracing apps, there was a lot of involvement of private actors that, of course, have different forms of accountability with respect to public actors. And this speaks of how the issue of trust actually depends on the way in which we address the ethical aspects of these new digital health technologies. But it's also important to say who needs to attend to those ethical aspects. No? So in our case, in the case of vaccine passes, mostly it's policymakers, public authorities that are engaged in creating the public policy conditions for those technologies to exist and to be used. These are the main actors that are responsible for dealing with the ethical aspects, and as a consequence, they are responsible for the creation and maintenance of public trust in those technologies. This is not to say that developers or private actors are not important. Of course, they are. They have specific responsibilities in producing reliable tools, but also they have responsibility in creating and maintaining trust. But what I would like to convey is that I think that the bulk of the responsibility for public trust, in my view, lies with governments and or international organizations like WHO, of course, and in particular with their capacity to create a credible governance framework around those tools. A credible governance framework is not just a system of control. Of course, it's not. I'm not talking about policing the use of these tools or limiting their availability or limiting the capacity of developers to come up with smarter solutions. What I refer to when I speak of credible governance is the capacity to collect and take into account public input about the use of those technologies, and putting in place mechanisms of oversight and accountability around those tools. So are there best practices to do that? Actually, at ETH Zurich, we have looked extensively at the proliferation of digital health technologies in the space of public health response to the emergency. And in particular, we have looked at digital contact tracing as like the first and most prominent technology so far that has been developed and deployed in many countries to try to contain the virus. And we have projects together with colleagues at the Berman Center for Bioethics at Johns Hopkins University in the US, and we're trying to map what is happening, and also we're trying to track the emergence of new technologies. As I said, vaccine passes are the next big thing, and we are extensively working on that. But also that there might be more trivial or apparently trivial technologies that might require our attention. For example, the alerting system about the opening up of vaccination slots that I mentioned at the beginning is a very interesting example, because we are putting a great deal of work in trying to minimize data use and trying to make data architectures decentralized, secure, and reliable and interoperable. But then for doing something trivial like getting to know when it's my turn, not my individual turn, but the turn of my category, then what do we do? For that, we collect GPS data, which that was, I mean, until now, like anathema. So what we noticed is that privacy definitely takes center stage in the ethical discussion about digital technologies in this space. Privacy is definitely being considered central in digital contact tracing. And I have to say, it was never really in tension with effectiveness. It actually took precedence over it. So we never had discussions, at least in Europe, about, okay, how much privacy can we give away in exchange for a system that tracks contacts in an efficient way. Actually, this was never an option, no? Because the assumption was without privacy and security, people would simply not participate. So in Europe and in the US also, what we opted for was privacy by design systems. Privacy by design means systems that are designed in a way that minimizes privacy-related risks and maximizes security, okay? Now, the point is, we can ask ourselves, did it work? Well, not really. So I think that digital contact tracing technologies were very safe, at least in their European incarnation, with respect to privacy, but there was not a lot of trust in them. So, or maybe not sufficient interest in them. And they were not developed, downloaded and used to a degree that matched the expectations. So what did we learn from that? What can we learn from that? Well, in a sense that technologies are not independent from governance efforts that try to make them socially viable. So new technologies are social as well as technical artifacts. No, if we ignore that, basically we're going to be surprised about what might happen with vaccine passes as well, as we are being surprised about the low level of uptake of digital contact tracing apps. So in the case of vaccine passes, to a certain extent, I think that the concern is still privacy, and I mean informational privacy. So privacy about the data that is exchanged through these infrastructures. This has to do mostly with the digital form that that is being imagined for those vaccine certificates, because I mean, for other paper-based certificates, really this is not too much of a concern, I think. I mean, maybe just because we are more used to this paper-based format of medical certificates in general. But I'm wondering whether the public is really all that concerned about, for example, where data resides in a nation rather than another, or how data is stored, how is it made accessible. These are all important issues, I think. But I think that in the case of digital contact tracing, for example, we saw that this was one of the most privacy robust digital technology ever developed, but still its history, brief history, is so far an history of failure due to low penetrance or reluctance on the part of the public. And definitely we could say it might be a history of trust failure. in the case of vaccine passes, the process is to some extent less trustworthy or less robust. For example, the EU regulation on digital green certificate actually says there is no time for inclusive deliberation about vaccine passes. So due to urgency, we have to unroll them. So in principle, this should be less trustworthy. But the assumption here is that there seems to be more uptake because there is more demand for these vaccine passes. No, so think about the New York State Excelsior Pass for sporting or cultural events. I mean, the assumption there is that people would want to use it because they want to go back to see I don't know, the New York Knicks playing, or concerts, or go to the movies. But in the US, for example, at the moment, there is a huge wave of political opposition against vaccine passes that I have to say I was not expecting. There is a number of executive orders that are trying to prevent entities that use vaccine passes from having commercial relationship with certain states. There are bills being introduced both at the state level and at the federal level, trying to prevent government from introducing or mandating the use of vaccine certificates, be them digital or paper-based. And I see that the concern there is not very much about privacy, or not, I should say, informational privacy. It's more a concern about the intrusion in private life, which is also another dimension of privacy, but doesn't matter. So there are people who are worried about the state taking a paternalistic stance with respect to individual choice. There are people who are afraid that in an indirect way, the introduction of a vaccine pass might represent a de facto mandate for vaccination that they think should stay voluntary. So these kind of objections look at vaccine passes as further limitations of liberty and choice. Whereas, I mean, my own concern would be the opposite. I would think that they will enable liberty, no? But still, I do think that these are genuine ethical concerns that we should discuss. But I also think that the benefit of immunity certificates outweighs such concerns. So it's greater. From a public health ethics perspective, governments, I think, should create, for sure, privacy robust systems for immunity certification, but that alone is not going to do the job of creating trust. That's my bottom line. I think you need to say to the public that this system is secure, of course, but most importantly, that we need it because it's beneficial for us all. And it's not another limitation of your freedom. It's actually an expansion of it. And it's a way to go back to some form of normality or new normality. In other words, I think that the governance effort around introducing those systems is one that should present in a credible way the justifications, including the public health ethics justification for introducing those systems, because making them secure is crucial. Making them privacy robust is crucial, but it's not going to be sufficient. So it's necessary, but not sufficient to create trust. This is, I think, what we might say we have learned from this past 12, 14 months, in which there has been an expansion, as I said at the beginning, of the role of digital health technologies, especially in the domain of public health.
Thank you so much, Alessandro, for this fascinating insight into the ethical perspective around health certificates. So with that, Moritz, I would say let's open up the discussion. So please, yes, dear participants, raise your hands, ask your questions. We want to be this as interactive as possible.
Yes, so if you, there's Deepak. Go ahead.
Yeah, great presentations. I have a question for Garrett. Garrett, you were talking about this, this vaccination drive. Now, how do we manage when certain countries have different vaccination which are not globally certified? For example, India and China have their own vaccines. And if the US does not allow that vaccines, it would be in US hand that Indians can travel or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually, thankfully, it's way above my pay grade. But I think the question comes down to, so the international certificate for vaccination and prophylaxis, which is the digital, it's the yellow card. The precedent there that comes in under the international health regulations focuses on yellow fever and in some cases polio. It's a small number of countries that have adopted and used that approach, and the format of the vaccine certificate to enable and facilitate cross-border purposes. In that case, those are vaccines that have been approved or pre-approved by WHO for inclusion and use for that. The example of, and the European Union is having this challenge, as we are as well, of there are a huge number of vaccines. They're named different things in different contexts, and you're absolutely right. In some cases, one country will accept another country's vaccine, but in other countries bilaterally they won't. We want to ensure that the specifications allow for, if a country bilaterally has agreed to use a particular vaccine, that the specification allows for that, that it doesn't limit the vaccine to only those that have been approved by WHO. But again, that's still being negotiated, and that's still part of the considerations that we have between now and the end of June. Yeah, it has geopolitical implications because some vaccines haven't yet been approved by one country, but have been approved by another. Some have been approved by WHO, but not another country. It's a real mess. So we have, among other things, we have in our pipeline to ensure that there's a vaccine registry, that product registry that indicates a metadata that will be helpful to facilitate that, recognizing that names should be standardized. Also, information about the things such as when a person would need to come back for their second vaccination could be brought into that metadata registry, as well as things like which countries bilaterally are, or which market, actually I'm forgetting the name, but it's essentially which countries have adopted or have regulated to support that vaccine. And so I think that's market authorization, sorry, that's the term. So which countries have market authorized particular vaccines, and that kind of registry would, I think, facilitate and support, rather than each country or each company having to understand the bilateral nature of one vaccine being agreed to by particular countries and not others. It's going to be fairly complex, is our assessment. Thanks. Over.
Thank you, Garrett, and thank you, Deepak, for this great question. I think that's one of the main bones of contention, to understand how are we going to manage different vaccines, which are assessed differently by different states. Are there other questions to one of our speakers, or more of them? If there's not at the moment, I would have a question. Yeah, maybe again back to Garrett, because I'm just thinking about what Alessandro said about the responsibility of international organizations and public authorities, sort of to include, to generate trust by including the public, taking the public input into account. having some sort of mechanisms of control as well. What are you doing at WHO to ensure this? Are you like how in practice how is civil society or the general public invited to also consulted and invited in the discussions?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Moritz. And I see Paul has got his hand up as well, but
Yes.
I'll answer this one. So you're absolutely right. There is, as you, I think probably all of you know, WHO is a member state driven organization. That said, we have a great interest and processes that where we try to establish open calls for participation from not just member states or scientists, but the broader stakeholder communities as well. In the case of this work, we did put a public call back in December, and we had about 250 applicants. We identified 183 of them against trying to ensure that that there were no conflicts of interest. That said, we will be opening the process to more member state involvement because the number of participants from the South wasn't as robust as we had hoped. And in discussions with member states in the last several months, there's been a request to ensure that we strengthen that. We have put out each of the iterations of the specifications are put out for public review. And that we had from March 19th through April 12th, we had an open public call for comments on the specifications. We've documented, I think there were like 400 comments. We brought those into, and we'll be releasing a release candidate 2 in about 2 weeks time, maybe 10 days time actually. And again, that'll be open to the public for comment. And we want to make sure that it's an implementable standard or specification. And that becomes important from the perspective of, we need to make sure that it's adoptable by technology companies, and also that member states feel confident that it is something that's implementable and not an ideal that, you know, the fact that we've made sure that it's paper first, we've tried to make sure that it works offline. Those are criteria that were driven by the discussions from the constituencies that were on the working group. So we're trying our best, and please feel free to comment on the specifications when it becomes available in 2 weeks. It's on the WHO website. I can provide linkage to that. So
thank you so much for these clarifications, Garrett. And my apologies, Paul, for not seeing your raised hand.
No problem, no problem.
You can now ask a question.
Well, it's not so much a question. I think I just got a few observations. And the first one is, in many of the calls that I've been on kind of in this space, and I should firstly say that I'm from Roche Diagnostics, and I'm more of a software professional than a kind of a health professional. But many of the conversations that I've had in this space, people have been careful about using the term immunity certificate. And I think immunity in this context is a word that we really should maybe try and avoid. Moving away from that, maybe onto the technology aspects. I think one thing that is not generally understood is that when we talk about the standards and the implementations that are emerging, supporting credentialing and management of certificates in this space, these are new technologies. We are very much at an inflection point in terms of the way that we can manage decentralized identity and trust at scale. And the passports that you see emerging, the Common Pass, the Good Health Pass recommendations, even IBM's Pass, they are not built on centralized technologies. So I've seen, references to PKI, and PKI may be used at some points, sort of in the system as a trust anchor, but generally, what we're talking about here, and I'm going to use a phrase which Ellie mentioned, is something which is called self-sovereign identity, which is the inflection point upon which these passports are built. And that gives sovereignty of individuals over identity. And it follows that they have sovereignty over data. And that will also change the way that we manage health data, not immediately, but over the next 5 to 10 years. So we're going to see the assertion of individual sovereignty over control of their identity and control of their data, and that's going to significantly flip on its head a lot of the centralized architectures that we currently have that are now in place regarding data sharing. I've heard some comments about privacy concerns and trust concerns, and this is very much at the heart of self-sovereign identity. If you go and look at the work that organizations like W3C have been doing in this field, Linux Foundation Public Health, mydata.org, it's all about returning control to the individual, and it's quite deeply technical in terms of how it works. But what it means is that privacy and ownership of data is really at the top of the stack in terms of what you get as a user. And the ability to centralize data and to share data and to monetize data, more importantly, is weakened.
Thank you, Paul, for this comment about self-sovereign identity and technical considerations to have. We have time for one more question, and there's Imad who raised his hand. Afterwards, we will also have you will also have the opportunity to discuss and ask questions in the smaller breakout groups. And if so, you can also, if you like, you can also give us your questions, and we then forward them, of course, to the speakers. Imad, you can ask questions. Thank you.
Yeah, another question to Garrett. Sorry to torture you with question again. So with the digital passport, immunity passport, or whatever, vaccination passport, we see a lot of international players jumping in order to enable interoperability. We can see the World Health Organization. We can see also the IATA, the Airplanes Association, which is great. I'm wondering why this did not happen for the contact tracing app. They were struggling to make it interoperable between countries, and it didn't happen. I'm wondering what is the difference between the two contexts. It wasn't the business of the World Health Organization, or it was too fast.
Thank you, you can answer.
Thanks for that question. I think that there is, I would say, a precedent both from the perspective of vaccine cards in the health space. WHO recognizes that there's dual purpose or dual use of this vaccination certificate approach. One is the continuity of care. The other is the proof of vaccination for cross-border purposes. The continuity of care really relates to the domestic use. And that's something where you're trying to ensure that someone is able to come back they're also ensuring that they have access to their own personal health record. In many countries, a child immunization record is a kid, it's a common document that countries will have and ensure that mothers and families have access to. So there's I would say there is a long history of its use. In the case of international travel, the International Certificate of Vaccination and Prophylaxis exists within an international policy framework. I think, so WHO sees this as a health document, and IATA and ICAO see that when it becomes about transport, that information is also important for the transport sector. And so in some ways, we have a common interest and in ensuring that the systems will be able to be used interchangeably and that there's a minimum data set that can be used for both. And so why did WHO not act on the proximity tracing apps? WHO is a risk-averse organization, and the science is still emerging around proximity tracing apps. There was work at Oxford that did emerge and was demonstrating some value, but the evidence is still not there. Obviously, if the uptake had been higher, I think we would have seen a lot more benefit from the proximity tracing apps. I just want to also note this issue of immunity, certificate, laboratory results, and recovery status, because I think the language is important here. As an organization, as WHO, we're trying to mitigate risks, and we see all of these different approaches as helping to reduce and mitigate risks, whether it's a mask or whether it's knowing your COVID status or whether it's having had a vaccination or having been recovered. All of those reduce the risk for others. And so, yeah, we haven't used the term immunity. We're definitely recognizing that each one of those pieces become important, but the pass element becomes important for travel. And the certificate aspect becomes important for, ensuring that it's verifiable. And so all of those pieces come together. And as an organization, we're very committed to reducing risks, and we see these pieces as part of that. And that is reflected in the emergency committee recommendations from the international health regulations last week. And so we hope these will emerge as tools, and the interoperability between systems. ICAO and IATA have been very strongly supportive and have been a partner to the work that we've been doing. And we've also been working with the European region, the European Commission, to ensure that we have a consistency in the standards that are used and the architecture, so that we're not developing parallel systems, and ensuring that that will eventually be compatible with ICAO and other things when and if they use it for travel as well. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Garrett, for this concise answer. Also about the point on immunity. Of course, it's all the devil is in the words. It's important to specify this. I'm really sorry, Paul. We need to move on with the workshop, but please stay with us. Bring your questions into the breakouts, or send us also a mail if you want to have a specific question to one of the speakers. It's always welcome, and we're happy to forward it. Thank you so much, Garrett, Alessandro, and Ellie, for your great inputs on what is being done, both in the private sector as well as at the World Health Organization, and how the academic world and sort of public ethics field is looking at these systems which are currently being implemented. Now, I will